Tony Blair, if there's no deal, and that looks more likely by the hour, the Benn Act kicks in 10 days from now. It forces the government to ask Brussels for a Brexit delay beyond October the 31st. Is that act robust enough to ensure that happens?
I think so. I mean, I'm not an expert on the constitutional theory, but it looks to me as if it's enough to ensure that the government is legally obliged to seek an extension.
And if Brexit is delayed then by the Benn Act, what possible excuse is there then for not having a general election?
Well, I think the reason for not having a general election is that if you want to resolve Brexit and there's a deadlock in Parliament and Parliament can't agree over Brexit and therefore you have to go back to the people to break the deadlock, then a general election, in my view, is the wrong way to decide that, because that's about who is the government of the country. The right way to decide it is to go back not on the general question of who governs, but on the specific question of Brexit.
But the government has no majority or authority. It's no programme it can get through Parliament. It's in office, but it's not in power. I mean, surely any opposition politician would relish an election, a chance to get rid of the government.
Absolutely. And by the way, there's no reason why you shouldn't have an election. That's not my point. My point is, don't decide Brexit through it. So there are two separate questions. One is a general election. As you say, the government has run out of steam. And of course, an opposition always wants a general election. And Labour, of course, will want a general election. That's not the issue. It's the point of principle that you shouldn't decide Brexit through that. And you can have a general election, you can have a referendum. They're two separate things.
Let's be honest here. You don't want an election because you think the Tories would win.
I think that there is a real possibility that they win by reason of two things which are not actually to do with Brexit per se. The first is that you will have a split opposition vote. I mean, we have a system really designed for two parties, but you're going to have a three-party contention in this because the Lib Dems are resurgent. Labour and Lib Dems are both polling in the 20s at the moment. So you could have a situation where a Tory government with a majority emerges with 35, 38, even 40% of the vote. They will then claim a mandate, by the way, for no deal, when actually the parties opposed to no deal may have a larger percentage of the vote. So that's a very powerful reason why a general election is wrong in principle.
You don't want an election because you fear the outcome. You want a second referendum because you didn't like the result of the first. What kind of Democrat are you?
I'm a perfectly sensible Democrat.
But one that only likes elections when you win.
No, hang on a minute. If Brexit is the question, right, if that's the reason we're in this mess is Brexit, right? It's not a general question of politics, it's Brexit.
Well, the reason we're in the mess is that this Parliament cannot agree a way forward.
On Brexit.
So have an election.
No. So if Brexit is your problem and Brexit's the question, go back to the people on Brexit. The question actually should be put the other way round to the Boris Johnsons of this world. Why are they worried about asking people specifically whether they want a no-deal Brexit? And the answer to that is they're afraid they lose that. So yes, of course, I'm worried about a Brexit general election because for the reason I've just given you. You could end up in a situation where despite a majority of the votes cast for parties that are anti-no deal, the government claims a majority for no deal as a result of the way the electoral system works. And to be honest, look, you're right. There are people who will be opposed to no deal, think that is a risk, but think the election of Jeremy Corbyn is a more substantial risk. But that's not the basis on which we should decide Brexit.
Is it, though? What is a bigger risk to this country, no deal or a Corbyn government?
I think the most immediate risk to this country is a no-deal Brexit. That's my view. But, I mean, I say that, and as I've expressed on many occasions, I have huge reservations about the Corbyn leadership. However, the point that I'm making is, if your problem is Brexit, go back on Brexit.
Except you want a second referendum, but Parliament has voted 4 times against a second referendum.
Yeah. So, but they've also voted against Theresa May's deal, they've voted against the other alternatives, and they've voted against no deal.
So this Parliament can't make up its mind. It knows what it doesn't want. That's clear. It doesn't want to leave on no deal, but it doesn't want a referendum either, a second one. So let's elect a Parliament that can break the logjam. That's the argument.
I know. I mean, you can go around to this in circles, but the fact is, if you've got an election where the principal argument is around Brexit, you're mixing it up with other questions, which are the questions about who governs for the next 5 years, which are a completely different set of questions. And all I'm saying is a very simple point of principle. If your problem is Brexit, and the question the question's got to go back to the people, put it back to the people in a form that they will understand and vote on the merits of the two respective positions, which are basically no deal or no Brexit.
That would be the question you would want. It would be basically on the ballot paper, no deal or no Brexit.
Well, I think the government, it depends what happens in this next period of time, but I think the government's position is going to be on one side of the ballot paper and Remain is going to be on the other side of the ballot paper. And by the way, people talk about the exact framing of the question. In the end, it's going to be very obvious. If we go back to the people and the people vote to leave again, then that is, frankly, an end of the matter.
But let's just summarise what you're saying here. The public voted to leave in 2016. You want to rerun that. Parliament has voted 4 times against a referendum. You want to ignore that?
I don't want to ignore it. I'm just simply saying in the end, and it's not a rerun, by the way, of 2016. This time we are going to be taking the decision with the benefit of 3 years of knowledge and experience. It's a decision of this magnitude. After this mess, we will have a clear government position, and I don't think you can argue in June 2016 you can say clearly they voted for no deal Brexit. You're going back to the people, and I'm not ignoring what Parliament said, I'm simply advocating the sensible solution if you've got a problem on Brexit is go back on Brexit.
Well, let's just see if the referendum's even possible, the second one. The Ben Act suggests an extension of our membership until the end of January next year, 2020. That's not long enough to hold a referendum, is it?
Well, it could be, but because
it couldn't actually. The Institute for Government said it would take a minimum of 21 weeks for a referendum.
I know, but this is all based on the idea that, for example, it takes you 3 months to get through the legislation for a referendum. As Parliament has indicated, you could truncate that enormously. Look, there's no technical reason why you can't have a referendum.
No, but how long would it take, and who would be the government while we waited for the referendum?
The government is the government you're going to have now, and that is inevitable, I'm afraid, as a consequence of where we are and where we got to.
This government said it doesn't want another referendum. This Parliament has said it doesn't want another referendum. So how do you get one without a general election?
Well, you get one if Parliament changes its mind or if the government changes its mind. I mean, look, my purpose is not to tell you how you do the parliamentary calculations and get to majority. My purpose is simply to advocate, as I do with MPs of both sides at the moment, and say to them, you're crazy to have a Brexit general election.
But as we waited for this referendum, and it will take some time, we can have an election pretty quickly before Christmas. We couldn't have a referendum by then. Who would be the government while we waited for this referendum?
The government is the government now.
Mr. Johnson will not preside over a government with a referendum. So should the Remain parties back a Corbyn government?
No, look, I don't think you'll get to a caretaker government. But the fact is, leave aside whether you can get to the position I'm advocating. I'm simply advocating it. I mean,
but I'm trying to work. But we could advocate all sorts of things.
No,
I could advocate that we should go to Mars tomorrow, but it probably won't happen. I'm trying to work out how you get.
Somewhat more likely than that.
How you get? Well, you've not given me reasons why it will be.
But I've given you a very solid reason why I think a referendum is much more plausible. Although my principal point is to argue why it's much more rational, but it's much more plausible for this reason, Andrew. That if you look at what is happening in Parliament at the moment, there is complete deadlock, and it is accepted the deadlock's got to be broken by going back to the people. Right. So you go back to the people through an election or a referendum. It's a choice, and all I'm saying is it's better to do it through a referendum.
Would a government of so-called national unity deliver your referendum?
It could do, yes. If the government, for example, refused to abide by the law and they were removed. But I think a government of national unity is rather a long shot.
Who would lead it?
That depends on a consensus emerging in Parliament.
I mean, would it not be remarkable if Mr. Corbyn wasn't asked at least of a first chance at forming one?
Yeah, he might be, but I think he will struggle to get the necessary votes because there'll be Liberal Democrats and Tory rebels who would not support him. But you only get to that if the government, frankly, you only get to a government of national unity if the government is trying to avoid implementing the legislation that Parliament's passed. But I don't think they will do that.
Are you not worried that if we headed towards a so-called government of national unity, that many people wouldn't see it as such at all? They would see it as a bunch of Remainer losers forming a government, that those who voted to leave in 2016 have been denied the chance to leave, and here are people that they beat in 2016 now forming a government. I mean, wouldn't that be incendiary?
Well, you're right, it would be extremely controversial, which is why it's better to simply skip over that and go straight to the question of a referendum.
But since Mr. Johnson has vowed to fight another referendum, quote, with every fibre of his body, I still don't see how you get there.
Yeah, I know, but Andrew, he's also said he'll go out on the 31st of October, come what may, but I think he won't. So, look, it's, as I say, we carry on having the same,
but it's because
the same argument.
But because if you believe, as you do strongly, in a second referendum, it is important to then lay out the path to that second referendum. And as I see it, so far, I don't see the route.
No, so far, you're right, it hasn't been accepted. But my point is that actually, as people start to go through the alternatives, they're going to understand. And your national unity point is a case in point. If you form the national unity government to have the referendum, why not just have the referendum?
As things stand, though, it looks like we are entering a world in which the choice is fast becoming a really binary one. No deal or no Brexit.
Yeah.
That's a big gamble.
It is a big gamble.
You happy with that gamble?
No, I'm not happy with it, but I think it's the reality, frankly.
But let me just highlight the gamble for you. If there's a general election, Mr. Farage's Brexit party and Mr. Johnson's Tory party will fight separately. If there's a referendum, Mr. Farage and Mr. Johnson will be on the same side. The two most formidable, highest profile names in British politics will be on the same side, arguing pretty much for no deal. Who'll lead the Remain campaign?
I don't know. That's going to have to be decided.
You would have no one to match either of them, would you?
Well, I don't know about that. You have to see. I don't know. I'm not going to start chucking out names, but yeah, you have to organise.
So that's how big a gamble it is. You haven't even got a leader for you. First of all, we don't know how you'll get to the referendum, and if we do, you don't know who's going to lead your side.
Well, who leads the referendum campaign? I mean, there are prominent people on all the political parties who are opposed to a no-deal Brexit. So I think that leadership will emerge, and it may be that it is a more collective leadership, and perhaps it should be. I don't think there's any harm in that.
How confident are you Remain would win a second referendum?
I believe we'd win, but I agree. It's a very open question.
That's how big a gamble it is?
Yeah, it is a big gamble, but Brexit's a big gamble. To anyone who's studied this, Brexit is not just about Brexit. It's about a whole cultural and economic set of questions that have got to be confronted and dealt with. If you do that, you can reunify the country after a fresh vote. If you don't, you're going to remain very divided. But just remember this, Andrew, if we end up tumbling out of Europe without a deal, and there's been no return to the people on that question, that will also be an incendiary outcome.
Tony Blair, thank you.
Thank you.